Welcome to the Watercooler Podcast, your number one podcast on all things organizational change, with your hosts Marcella and Bartwin from Defiant.
Hey, welcome to this podcast on organizational change. Organizational change is a big topic for us all, and especially for us, meaning Marcella and myself. We are organizational change specialists, but we thought it might be smart to bring in the voice of reason and actual science in here. So that's why we've listed the services of Brendan Vorster, organizational psychologist. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. And awesome pronunciation of my surname, by the way, as well, Bartwin.
Those 3 hours of practice really paid off there. All right, well, let's talk about the main theme of this episode. There's so many themes that Marcella and I want to fire at you, but let's start with the big one first. So organizational change or change in general seems to be very scary for people when they are confronted by it. And of course, one of the major statements is, the only constant is change. In the world, everything keeps changing around us. So how come we're still so afraid of that? What are your thoughts on that, Brendan?
Oh, it's probably gets back to that deep primal need for us to stay safe, right? We want to survive in this very difficult world, being out there amongst the predators. Like, I'm from South Africa, and Africa where you've got the lion. I know in New Zealand there might not be many of those going around, but we still somehow, even if we're walking out in nature in these beautiful trail walks and the sun starts setting and you're walking around, you still have this innate kind of fear of what's going to come for me. And I think that's probably what we're dealing with, even though a lot of change got nothing to do with physical pieces to preserve, but it's that psychological piece that we still somehow confuse as part of what's happening in the brain and in the circuitry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, especially when something sudden happens. In preparation for this podcast, I listened to a bit of Simon Sinek, the big guru on all things organizational change and transformation. He mentioned that people don't fear change. They rather fear sudden change. You need to take on a different role, or maybe even something smaller, like present something. Like, everybody has that anxiety when the facilitator in the room says, let's introduce ourselves with a short 5-minute chat and so maybe it's a funny quote about yourself that nobody knows yet about you, and everybody goes like, yeah, that's don't look him in the eye, don't start with me kind of situation.
Yeah. And in fact, I've got a very lived, real example of that in the week where we did training for a group of leaders in one of our organizations we work in. And we said to them, can you just for the next 5 minutes go in and find a song that you like, go and Google it, get the lyrics. And in 5 minutes time, we would like you to sing it to us so that we can get you can imagine what the people went through. I mean, it was real lived trauma for people in the room, because you combine two of the probably the biggest fears, which is change and that element of public speaking or being put in the spotlight.
Yeah. Oh, wow. And how did it go, by the way? Because I'm curious now. Did somebody go like, all right, so roll the tape and here's my favorite Frank Sinatra song, I'll take it?
Some people were surprisingly ready for it. Now, we don't know how much of that was just a facade of saying, okay, I'm ready for it.
Exactly.
And bolstering it. So even though we didn't actually follow through with the exercise, we still had some people saying, hey, karaoke night, we need to go and organize something and then sing these songs. I think back to your question around the sudden element of change. David Rock is one of those people that he wrote a really profound book a good couple of years ago called Your Brain at Work. And I thought it was such a suitable title.
Oh, nice.
Like, how does the brain work, but also the brain at work? And he brought in something called the SCARF model, so SCARF, and he's talking about the innate need of a human to have status, so it's the recognition part, but then the one I want to get at is the C for certainty. So you want certainty. The others are autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. But if I hone in on that certainty one, as soon as we experience something that is not directly aligned to what we believe about the world, so what I believe about the world, be it in how I think in my head, what I feel emotionally, and how that operates within my environment, or in a physical sense, just seeing that change is what starts activating all of the neurosystem parts, which is then before you know it, you're again trying to see where that line is going to come from. And even though it's completely faulty way of thinking, probably in the world that we're in.
Interesting. And then what's for me interesting is is you know sudden change will bring certain anxiety with it, or potentially the fear of being humiliated in the group, especially when you the example that you gave about singing a song and being out there for the group. But if you are a leader in that situation and there is a need for change, things have to change. So you can't. There's no two ways around it. So you know it's going to bring a certain level of anxiety with it. What would be some practical ways to sort of set the tone correctly in order to minimize or mitigate some of those fears that people immediately will have when announced with a change initiative?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can go and have a look at a couple of the really good public speakers out there or people in leadership roles that would often just create a bit of a common understanding in a group to almost deliberately just do something that makes them vulnerable, laugh
Hmm.
about it a little bit, announce the fact that it kind of surprised them as well, and just say, hey, it's okay to fail, in other words, and to be surprised by what's going on around you. And just that quick act can really lead with that vulnerability that's often required. And it sets that
Yeah,
permission in motion. So we're intuitive in nature. So just doing that is probably a good start.
yeah,
But still, so many people see failure not as a lesson learned, right? As coaches,
Mm,
as consultants, we all know the words we need to use to tell our failure is just a way to succeed and blah blah blah. Picture perfect. But still, people perceive failure as not good enough. I am not good enough, or I've not done the best thing I could, or the results turn out opposite of what I was hoping for. So that whole failure is okay kind of attitude, it's so much harder to create with somebody,
mm,
especially in a change that is not coming from your own intrinsic motivational point. Then
mm.
it's so hard to say, oh, failure, it's all good. I probably am the worst critic of myself, but failure to me has never felt like a success.
it's the weird acronym that they also use, or the weird saying with fail fast. And you are
Yeah.
ingrained like from early days on, like as a childhood, like failure is not a great thing, right? So if you get an F on a
Mm.
test, or like somebody scolds you in the classroom,
Yeah.
it's not a good thing. You go home like, well, I failed
Mm.
fast, mom. Here's my F on my test. She's probably like,
Yes.
yeah, I want you to do better next time. So even though the mindset of failing fast and experimenting has been proven helpful, how do we change that mindset that Marcella just pointed out?
I mean, there's so many things to just the last couple of minutes what we've spoken about, right? Because it resonates with all of us. We know we're surrounded by self-help kind of advice, but then also if you just go and take it over the last 4 decades, there's been a general movement, I think, where people are helping us to just acknowledge that we need to be aware of this thing called fear of failure. And can we reframe things? Can we possibly look at titles like one of the ones that really sat with me well over the years was Failing Forward, not
Yeah,
necessarily just failing fast, but how do you fail forward in a way to be okay with getting feedback quicker? Because that's how a child learned how to ride his bike.
yeah,
Yeah.
That's
exactly.
how we took that courageous step of getting onto our feet and taking that first step.
Mm.
And even with the learnings coming out of these last couple of decades was probably in the concept of these push bikes that got kids to learn how to actually cycle. Instead of having the pedals on, they
Yeah,
realized if you take the pedals off, they can focus on the act of just moving forward, losing their balance, correcting, and
exactly.
before you know it, I
Yeah,
know how to cycle. So we acknowledge that that's important. But I think part of that failure element that we're trying to preserve is this thing called survivorship bias. I think we
mm,
get swallowed up in wanting to identify that one individual that is deemed the successful example of having not failed, and they get elevated to the status of heroism so quickly that I think it makes it very hard for us to accept that, well, maybe I can be one of those people. So I want to try and survive through this experience unscathed, looking like I've been perfect, so that
yeah,
I can be
Mm.
one of those people. And we confuse the many attempts of the Edisons of the world having
Yeah.
gone through 1,000 fails before they got the light bulb working, or a guy like Bach in music having written, I don't know how many different failed attempts he had before he was successful. Those
Yeah.
things get
Mm.
unnoticed,
yeah.
unfortunately.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
point. Yeah, so many pop stars nowadays, they're more open about the amount of times that they had their albums rejected or the music being denied, and so long until they
Mm.
finally got signed a contract with the studio and got on with it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
that,
For example,
that's a good
Frozen,
point.
the movie. I've got three boys in the house, but my wife loves the movie even more. So and this came out, I think, in 2014, surprisingly, right? I think we're talking about 9 years ago. But the theme song of Frozen was a
Yep.
hit, but they had 17 failed songs before that. And I think that's
Yeah.
how do we
Yeah.
help people understand it's okay, start somewhere, and that your first attempt, if your first attempt at anything didn't embarrass you, you
Hmm.
waited too long.
Oh, that's a
Mm.
good one. You waited too long. You must have a bit of embarrassment in the beginning, is what you're saying.
Totally. Marcelo, if I just bring it back again, just a little bit to that question around the change piece. And I think that's where, again, the reframing, like, first of all, name the emotion, identify that you've just started kicking into that nervous system, which is the sympathetic nervous system, which is the one that's triggered by the amygdala that goes into hypothalamus.
Mm.
It starts going and putting in that reptilian brain saying, right, fight or flight. But if you become aware of the emotion, you realize that whether this is something that I created now that's got this change happening around me, or it's change externally, I can still then make a decision to go and reframe it, think about it in a different way, and then put that into practice as part of my progressing and going forward. And back to your question, Bartwin, around leaders, for example, and the role that they can play, was if the leader can start inviting change into their mindset regularly through, for example, books. There's really good literature. I've recently read a book called The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf Dobelli. And he's got 99 biases that he highlights for you. You can spend one every week, just time on one of them and think about, oh, how fascinating. Look how that's actually impacting me.
Yeah.
And then just to find the balance, it should get you to a point of becoming humble so that you realize, look, I don't know everything, but it should still inspire you to take some action and learn from that. But that keeps you in a mode of saying, like, wow, okay, how fascinating. Look at how
Yeah.
I can still grow in this. And then you start making that real around you, and the people start following suit when they see you doing that consistently. So I would make that a goal for me again this year, for 2024, is go and look at biases, go and look at how easily I get trapped into them, put it out there for people to join me in actually challenging those things. And then the more we do that, the more we set a wave in motion to allow us to deal with any form of change as a result.
Brendan, what I'm curious of is within an organization, the change that is often happen is never coming from you, right? You always feels like it's your CEO, it's your manager, it's somebody else who decided this needs to happen. Or it's the random consultancy company that comes in and says, hey, you should do
The worst.
SAFE because it's the greatest. Choo-choo train, everything goes. So often we find ourselves in a position that we feel like it's being done to us. As we now know, lots of people, if not all, have some level of fear when it comes to those kind of change initiatives. How are we able to spot fear for change in an organization? Because I think that is the most interesting thing, that it comes in different shapes and forms. So how can we spot those fear elements in people?
I like how just behind your question, you're already assuming the fear is there. So what can we do to spot it? There was a question a couple of years ago, and I can't remember who asked the questions around engagement, but it was a 21 question survey. And one of the questions they usually asked in there was, do you have a best friend at work? Now, I've heard over the years how a lot of people have challenged that question to say, didn't you mean a friend? Why a best friend?
Yeah.
But I think it's because that best friend is what gives you safety to allow you to share a bit more openly when you have fear. Now, that's a hard one, because how do you implant that kind of relationship into a business for people around the organization so that they can share more freely? I think it's maybe a challenge for us to ponder. But you do want to create safety in some way that people actually share it. Just putting it in a 360 survey or putting up a quarterly kind of a questionnaire is not really going to tap into that fear. You need trust. There needs to be an element of belonging that comes out of it. So instead of me coming up with a bit of advice, Marcella, around put this structure in place, put that strategy in place, I think we need to make a sense of belongingness, like Owen Eastwood wrote in his book called Belonging. Make that the intent, and I think you'll start spotting the conversations around the water cooler to highlight how people are actually feeling about the fear. And then you can address it still as a general thing. I don't think you have to address it with each individual, but it at least enables that part of the organization that's responsible for change management to start thinking about what are some strategies that they should go and test out based on what they are hearing around the water cooler, because we've started feeling more a sense of belonging. And part of that is probably to not announce big changes without having almost communicated the changes on the way beforehand too.
As a final question of mine, if you have that sense of belonging, but you're going to do a change initiative, so that sense of belonging is going to fall under attack, right? So people are going to feel fearful. Let's say I was a leader of the company, something practical I could do to create sense of belonging or regain that again. Do I need to do subgroups? Do I need an open Q&A session? Anything at all that you feel that would be a good first step in the right direction?
There's 4 things that experts, for example, your diplomats in foreign countries or people that needed to actually gain intelligence, for example, through the FBI, needed to always do. And those 4 things are: you need to focus on proximity. You need to be close to the people you want to get the intelligence from. Okay. You need to have frequent contact with them and interaction with them. The duration of the interactions needs to be of a good enough duration as well. It can't just be a 10-second interaction here. Sometimes it needs to be a bit longer. And then the 4th one is actually the quality of that interaction. Needs to be, they actually talk about the intensity of it. So I am referencing a book called The Like Switch. You're talking about focus groups, Bartwin, or you're talking about a leadership group having a panel session. You need to really strategize to over-communicate when it comes to these changes, and where they don't feel like they're distant from the people, but they can interact and ask questions. And I think that is a really key part of that strategy.
Love those 4. That's great. Yeah. So proximity was the first one. What was the second one? Remind me.
Yeah. So so proximity, in other words, closeness. You can't impact Mars yet; it's too far away. And then you need to go and look at the frequency of the interaction. So don't just check in with me once a month. It's not good enough. And number 3 is the duration.
What's your major takeaway, Marcella, listening in and asking questions to Brendan? What's the one thing that stuck with you?
Actually, that sense of belonging. With Defiant, we mentioned as well that we feel like organizations nowadays focus way too much on the framework and actions to get to a goal, and therefore forget about the whole belief system in an organization, which is based on the trust and the experiences and a belonging part that you feel within an organization. The other thing that I take away what you mentioned, Brendan, organizations need to focus more on prepping for the change, communicating that change is going to happen, what it is, why it is, so that people can have that build up towards, okay, what does it mean for me? How am I going to deal with this? And to look for that best friend in their organization to have the water cooler chat. I think those 2 things will stay with me.
What I'm always struggling with is I can agree upon the main place stuff, right? The commonplace stuff. So sense of belonging, there's nobody's going to say, no, we don't want to have that, right? That's stupid. We don't want a sense of belonging in the company. Everybody wants that. But the thing is, I guess what I would be looking for as a leader as well is thinking, how might I make this as practical as possible? What would be the first thing I can do to get it to the next level? So that was a great 4-step suggestion there for any leader to make. Good stuff. Looking forward to our next chat, Brendan, and thanks for lifting our game.
Hey, it's been
awesome.
Thank you for your time.
No worries.
Thanks, Brendan.
All right.